Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Spicy Deck Tech, or the Deck of the Week. So this is the second time I'm doing this, and this week we have a particularly spicy list that Aaron Damon was nice enough to pass along to me. And interestingly enough, I picked the deck that I wanted to do the deck tech on in round two. So I didn't actually know who had won the tournament at this point. I just knew that Aaron's deck was particularly spicy, and I wanted to talk about it. But then Aaron was actually good enough to go on and win the tournament on Monday to validate my decision to spotlight his deck. So this is the Monday winning blue black fairy tempo deck that Aaron has made. So Aaron actually has quite a sort of strong reputation in the Victoria Highlander community for playing goblins. And when I was talking to him about this deck, I asked him, what made him want to play this deck, and he said, well, after you play goblins for so long, you kind of want to do some more things that are kind of unfair, and you want to think about things a little bit more, and so he knew he wanted to play blue. Um, and Aaron's played blue red decks in the past, but he said that he recently opened a Lorwyn booster pack, uh, or some booster pack from that block, and I believe it had an Una's Blackguard in it, and he thought, oh, this is just too sweet, so I'm gonna make a Faeries deck. So, from the most inauspicious of beginnings, we get this very very powerful Highlander deck, which is great. I think it's awesome that people are finding these kinds of inspirations to build decks. So what is this deck? I described it as a tempo deck. Um, and I think it is. I mean, we do have some pretty typical tempo elements, some low casting cost creatures. We're looking to play maybe one threat, maybe two, and then protect them with our bevy of counter spells. But what makes this deck really different from other tempo decks is that the build is not quite as typical as some other ones. And Aaron actually, when he builds his blue red tempo deck, tends to do this tends to do that in a sort of similar fashion to this, and it's very characteristic of him. He goes a little bit farther up the scale. So where other players like myself especially uh, want to build tempo decks with the theory that you're going to get some kind of creature onto the battlefield, you're going to protect it with some counter spells, do enough damage that eventually you're going to close out the game with zero cards in hand and your opponent about to stabilize. This deck isn't trying to do that. This deck really is looking to get a creature on board and really hold on to control of the game, and never really give it away. And and some of the green based tempo decks, like the blue green tempo decks and the bug tempo decks, do this as well, but it's not nearly as typical in a lot of the blue red builds. But this is something that Aaron does, and I think it's quite successful for him, and I really like the way that he builds these decks. So let's look at the elements of this deck, which really are very tempo-y. So we've got our fairly typical tempo things. We have a Delver's Secrets. We have some creatures like Thada Adel, Vendilion Click, some of our Ninja of the Deep Hours. Pestermite, Spellstutter Sprite's actually a pretty reasonable one. All of these are what I would qualify as like fairly typical tempo cards. Low cost creatures. Sometimes some of them have flash. But then, and we have these other elements of the tempo deck, like Force of Will, Misdirection. We have our pitch counter spells, and then we have a bunch of other counter spells, even stretching so far as to play Undermine. And then we have our few removal spells, our Dismember to get rid of problem permanents. We have our Repulse to keep our card advantage. But after that, this deck really does stop looking like a conventional tempo deck. What you'll notice is that we're playing things like Mind Twist. We really do go a little higher up the curve in order to try and completely lock our opponents out of the game. We're playing things like Bitter Blossom, which lends itself to a much grindier game, and also combos very well with the fact that we're playing a Fairies deck. We're playing cards like Factor Fiction and Jace the Mind Sculptor, which really are sort of much more control cards than they are tempo cards. Um, and you'll notice we're not playing Daze, like a free counterspell, which is fairly typical in tempo lists. And when I talked to Aaron about the conspicuous absence of Daze, he said, yeah, I really don't like falling behind in the land count. He says that's very problematic, and that he doesn't like doing it in the deck. And so he's not playing Days. Instead, he's playing, he's still playing the pitch counters because he thinks he can make up the card advantage with cards like Treasure Cruise, Ancestral Visions, Dig Through Time, etc. But, but yeah, so he's not playing cards like Days. We're kind of eschewing this notion of play just enough spells to keep our opponent off balance and kill them at the very end. You'll also notice that there are no stifles or shadow of doubts or anything like that in this deck. We're not really trying to get our opponents. We're actually we really are sort of looking to take full control of the game. So then let's look at the last element of this deck, which makes it really truly unique, which is of course the Faeries. So the Faeries are super cool. And one of the reasons why this deck is particularly spicy, I mean, it does just so happen that a bunch of Faeries happen to be pretty powerful cards in their own right, and would get played even if they weren't Faeries. So, Sower of Temptation, Glenelendra, Vendilion Clique, Pestermite, all of these cards see a reasonable amount of play anyway. But the ones that are kind of interesting are cards like Spellstutter Sprite, which really has struggled to find a home in Highlander, to the extent of my knowledge. We have other ones like Thieving Sprite and Una's Blackguard. Una's Blackguard actually has the potential to snowball incredibly and really sort of take over a game if left completely unattended. We have cards like Cloudseeder even, which is kind of like a jankier version of Bitter Blossom. It's a lot harder to get going, but still provides us an endless stream of creatures. And one of these things that Faeries tends to do pretty well is produce a reasonable number of creatures and produce a reasonable number of evasive creatures. But one of the classic problems that Faeries have is that a lot of their creatures are pretty small. Cloud of Faeries is a 1/1. Una's Blackguard is a 1/1. Una's Prowler is a 3/1, but is oftentimes a 1/1. Pestermite's only a 2/1. Spellstutter is only a 1/1. 2/2, 2/2, 3/1. These are all like reasonably small creatures. And so I think Aaron has come to quite an elegant solution to this, which is that you'll notice he's playing a bunch of equipment for a deck that's not playing Stoneforge. So we've got Skullclamp, Sigh of the Shinobi, which I'll get back to in a second, Bone Splitter, Umezawa's Jite, and Sword of Fire and Ice. Like 5 pieces of equipment for a deck that can't actually tutor for them in any way. Like, it's very clear that we want to draw some kind of equipment because we have all of these creatures that have an effect when they enter the battlefield. And there are some of them we want to keep it around. Like, obviously we want to keep Sower and Glenelendra. But a lot of these creatures, we get their enter the battlefield effect. And then once that's happened, we're fine. We're content to throw them away or have them just be a 1/1 body. And so when we have these sort of smaller creatures that we're either happy to kill with our Skullclamp, or aren't big enough to do enough damage on their own, we need this equipment to sort of compensate for that. Sigh of the Shinobi is certainly the most interesting piece of equipment in the deck that I don't think... I certainly didn't know what it did when I came across it in the deck. But all this is, I know you probably can't read it here, it's an equipment, it costs 2, and all it does is that when a creature enters the battlefield, you can equip it for free. It gives the creature +1/+1, and it can equip for 2. So this works great with all of our flash creatures or our small creatures that we're playing. We're just making them, a little bit bigger and turning them into real threats. The other thing about the deck that's pretty interesting is that Aaron has elected to play a couple of clone effects. So we have Phyrexian, Metamorph, and Sakashima Student for clone effects. And I didn't get a chance to talk to Aaron about everything about the deck, but I have to presume that these are in here as a way to sort of combat either bigger creatures or to just clone your own reasonable creatures, which seems great. Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to talk about is why does this deck need to be black? Because obviously tempo and more controlling end of the tempo spectrum decks exist in other colors, paired with blue, obviously. So what advantages in particular does black lend to us? So the first thing is obviously we get all these pretty sweet fairies. We get Bitter Blossom, which is a pretty big deal, and then we also get access to some hard removal spells. Aaron's not playing as many as I think I would in this deck, but obviously he's the one who went 4-0, so he knows what he's doing. But so you'll notice we get access to cards like Far Away and not incredibly painful Dismember. We could also be playing a bevy of other removal spells. And one of the problems that tempo decks classically have is that they eventually just get outclassed on the board by something. And I think having Thoughtseize and Inquisition and Duress to go along with a couple of black removal spells and our counter spells really allows this deck to seize control of the game. And then the way that Aaron has structured it, once he's taken control of the game, he's going to top deck a lot better than a lot of other tempo decks are going to, and that's going to allow him to stay in control of the game. So that's sort of the interesting thing that I think that black lends to this strategy. We also obviously get like some minor effects like Creeping Tar Pit and whatnot. But I think that that's the really interesting thing about being black in this strategy. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the points in the deck. The points are super spread out, which I think is a pretty good point structure for this style of deck. So the big point is Soul Ring. Soul Ring's just like generally a very good card, even if it's not necessarily optimal. Like Soul Ring. Soul Ring tends to look pretty good in a lot of decks. We have Umezawa's Jite, great, gonna pair with our equipment theme really well. The recently reduced in point cost from 2-1 Skull Clamp, which is great because at 2 points it really wasn't seeing a whole lot of play in lists, and at 1 I think it's a lot more reasonable for it to do so. So this is 5 points here. Our 6th point is Muddle the Mixture. This actually next week will no longer be a point, but right now is. This is actually like a pretty fair Muddle the Mixture, all things considered. This Muddle the Mixture is only getting cards like Bitter Blossom and potentially some kind of effective creature. But still, nonetheless, it is a tutor and an effective tutor, and with that in mind. And our last point is Mystical Tutor, another great tutor. We're playing this blue deck. We want to be able to go get exactly the kind of spell we need. Since we are playing so few removal spells, we do want to have a way to go get them. Yeah. So those are the points in this deck. But pretty good use of the points, I think. The last thing I wanted to talk about is why is this deck particularly spicy? And I think that should be obvious. I mean, like, this deck is super sweet. We get to play cards that are not in play in any other format anymore. We get to play one of my all-time favorite cards, Invisible Stalker, which is great. I really do like the fact that Aaron has managed to find a reasonably new bend on sort of a classic tempo strategy and has succeeded with it. That's really awesome. And lastly, I think that one of the really cool things about this deck that makes it especially spicy is how many different games it's capable of playing. So, we can play the control game, we can play the tempo game. Heck, we even have a Trinket Mage package that gets our Soul Ring and even some lands. This deck has clearly been well thought out and attacks from a lot of different angles and has a lot of different answers, which is really great. So that's it for this week, guys. I forgot to mention last week, but we have a blog. This is going to be posted on the blog, so if you are finding this just on YouTube, please feel free to visit us at canadianhighlander.wordpress.com. I'll put a link for that in the bottom in the description. But yeah, that's it for this week. So thanks very much, guys, and leave some comments below.